and welcome to today's video. There was a request in the Facebook group to talk about making backgrounds. Now, I have touched on this subject every now and again, and obviously I create some on camera, probably mainly in the creative snippets video or the studio vlogs, but I've never dedicated an entire video to it. And so when it was brought to my attention, if I could make a video like this, I thought, sure, why not? It's something that's a little bit laid back and very fun to do. And I have two kind of different approaches to making backgrounds. I make a lot of them for your Monday mantras. I also make them for your collage sheets. I love using them, and they're some of my favorites to use in my journals. They make great backing cards, like the full sheet ones make just instant covers for your journals. I really love the use of painted backgrounds in my journals. And so there are two kind of general approaches that I approach a background, and I'm going to go through those. One is the traditional way, where I do it all by hand, all with mediums and all that sort of stuff. And the other way is to create the components traditionally, some of them, create some components digitally, and then morph them together. So I'm going to be sort of glossing over the two. I'm also going to be talking about some of my favorite products that I like to use when making backgrounds. I tend to use the same sorts of things. There are a few things that I like to hit on when making a background. I have more backgrounds sort of floating around the studio, but I kind of just grabbed this month's one and this one. This one was actually a whole amalgamation of previous bits and pieces. There's bits from my mini TN in there, there's watercolor swatches, there's overlays of the background from this month, the black and white one. So you can see here is this here. This is also from another background. So these, I tend to make my backgrounds because I make them for you guys. I need to make sure that what I use is not from anyone else. So you need to spend a lot of time creating journal fodder, creating your own patterns, creating your own colors, making painted papers, a whole lot of that sort of stuff. Now, I see a lot of backgrounds where lots of bits of paper have been torn up, lots of little bits of paper, and then just glued down. And I'm not a huge fan of that look. It could be to someone's personal taste. It's not to mine. I like to make mine with larger scaled things. I also like to make sure that my piece looks cohesive by overlaying other things on top of it so that the pieces have some sort of joining mechanism, whether that be a color that's spread for sort of up into sections. I like to join everything up so it looks like one piece. I mean, there's obviously things here that are like I've just layered square pieces of paper on, and that is because this background was actually one of the backgrounds for one of these. So this background here is this size. I scan it really massive. I do 600 DPI so that I can make this a full scale page for you guys. But when I create backgrounds for Nooks, I kind of don't do the same thing, but it still works. But I don't actually focus on it the way that I would focus on an actual background for something else. So that's why I have bits and pieces in here that I'm not really caring about, hard lines and things, because I knew that it was going to get covered up. And like I said, you can see the little pattern here, you can see the little pattern here, and some of the patterning here. And that's kind of why there's hard lines and stuff in this one. I have added things digitally to sort of bring a bit more visual interest to it, but I'm gonna go through first some of my favorite supplies to make backgrounds with now. All right, let's chat about some of the things that I have out on the table. They should be very familiar with you because I use them all the time. And that is my first tip. Use what you have. I don't want you thinking that you need to go out and buy everything that I've got. Do not do that. I have been using this set of watercolor crayons, the Caran d'Ache one, since Boo was 2 and she is now 10 turning 11. So I've had a lot of my supplies a very long time. I use a lot of my supplies over and over and over, which is why supply documentation hasn't happened very much this year, because I'm using the same supplies over and over and over. And I want you to do the same. I don't want you thinking, oh, I don't have this, this, and this, and this, I can't make backgrounds. No, 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 no. Use what you have. I am just showing you the supplies that I like to use. Now, I know for a fact that most of you will have a whole heap of these supplies. I know that you'll have variations of these supplies. So I know that you can make backgrounds with whatever you have at home. There is no right way, no wrong way. This is just what I do. And it was a question that was asked of me. So I like to have a variation of opaque supplies and non-opaque, so more see-through, more layering supplies, things that I can build up color. I like to be able to lay down papers and then have elements of color lay over them while still being transparent. This doesn't always mean watercolor, because a lot of the times the papers that I use for my backgrounds are not very happy with watercolor, but I do like to use supplies that have a more transparency to them, that are more translucent, and that I like to have an element of seeing what's underneath. But then there are other supplies that I like to have them nice and opaque, so I can cover up and add large chunks of matte, not matte, but like solid color. So I have my Caran d'Ache watercolor crayons. I use these a lot. I use these a lot when creating my nooks, and I use the same sort of concept with them, where you can see bits and pieces of paper underneath, and you can see bits and pieces, so their transparency comes in there. Now these can be used on their own with water and you get the transparency, or I like to mix them with gesso when I want to make them more opaque. So this one is a jump on either sides of the thing, depending on what you add to it. I use a lot of gesso with these when I want to add them and make them more of an acrylic paint, and then I use them especially the yellows and things when I want to add nice sort of transparent color, but you can still see the patterns underneath. So I love a watercolor crayon. They're fabulous. These are basically the only ones I really use. I have watercolor markers. I could use those as well. I have the Letraset ones that I've had for eons as well. But these are things that sort of stick by the side of my table, and I use, like I said, they're very well loved. They're broken. They're in an acrylic container that just sits on the side of my desk, and I sort of use them as I go. The other thing I love are paint markers. There are so many paint markers on the market. I love the Posca ones. I still have a heap of the Liquitex ones, but when I want to work on top of things, I want more matte, and these kinds of things. They come in all different tips. As you can see, there's chunky, and then there is less, so you have fat tips and small tips. They come even bigger than this. I have quite an array of colors. They also have Sharpie make a poster paint marker. I have a couple of those, but generally my Uni Posca paint markers are my go-to. Have the opaque factor while still being easily controlled, because it's like a pen. So I use these a lot for mark making on top of things. I use these when I want a lot of color, and when I want a lot of really bold colors, because I have a lot of my favorites like the teal, the red, the yellows, the pinks, and those colors. So I generally use these a lot when making markers, when I'm making backgrounds. Sorry, a little bit tongue-tied. And they are fabulous, and I know a lot of people have these or have a paint marker in general. Jane's got some paint markers. I generally don't use these because they're a thinner one, and when I'm covering large areas, I generally want a bigger, fatter tip. So paint markers is something that I use as one of my opaque things, as well as like a matte acrylic paint. I love the Paper Artsy ones. I only have a few shades. I use them to death. You see me use them all the time, and they're in more neutral colors, so when I want to dull down some things, I generally head to these colors. I also have the Ranger acrylic paints by Diane Reaver, the Dilution paints. I have some of those, although I think mine have all dried out, so I need to see if I can revive them. I have an entire tub of acrylic paints down in my bookcase that I can call on, from different $2 paints to, I think there's Liquitex Basics in there. There's acrylic paint is on there. I just generally like these ones. They're nice and matte. They're very creamy. They glide really well, and I have a set of colors that By Bun, I've talked about this 100,000 times, suggested for a course that I was doing, and I've generally not bought any other colors and have loved them. And I think there's maybe 2 missing from here, a darker blue and another sort of taupe color, and they roam basically. Oh, there's one, another pink one. I think they're probably out in the dining room. I generally have these scattered, these colors, from all my areas that I work with, because I use them so much in a lot of areas of work. So a matte paint, you can use your paint pens. I just mix the two. I also like to use the Golden Quinn Gold, and this is like it's an acrylic paint, but it's very see-through. And I also really love the fluid acrylics by Golden, because they are also very see-through. So this is where I'm talking about the transparency kind of supplies. So things like the fluid acrylics, the Jane Davenport Incredible Inks, they're very see-through. I also have the PH Martins watercolor inks, they are see-through. The Eco line, they're see-through. Your fountain pen inks, you know that I use my fountain pen inks to paint with a heck of a lot of the time. They are also see-through and have a lot of punch. I also use the distress stains. I use those a heap. So you've got a lot of areas where you can use a see-through transparent color blocking medium. So if you don't have this sort of stuff, just use your watercolors. You know, that's not going to be any different either. So I always have a see-through element. Where is my background? Here. That Quinn Gold is here, and you can still see all that polka dotted tissue paper that is underneath, and that gives a look, so you can still see bits of the under papers, which gives a whole lot of difference. And I kind of do that when I'm trying to layer up things, when I want to leave things exposed, that sort of thing. And then when I want to cover up, I just use a matte paint and cover up that way. You can also use your acrylic paints and then water them down, add some water to them, wash them out. That will make them more transparent, less opaque, if you want to go down that route. But a transparent medium of some sort is always fun. I'm thinking most of you will have fountain pen ink, or an acrylic ink is also the same. I know people have those. I do have some acrylic inks as well. I have a lot of things, but this is my job, so that's why I have a variety of different things that you can use. And another thing that I love to use is watercolor or water-soluble graphite pencils. My favorite is the Stabilo, and it's the blackest and darkest. I love this thing to death. I have several of them, thanks to the lovely Sam, who found me a supply. I think I have 4 or 5 of them, and I use this everywhere. It's great for bold marks. It's great for adding dimension to things. But I also have like a Caran d'Ache liquid like watercolor pencils. So I have watercolor pencils in the graphite, and I also use just normal graphite pencil. These are my Blackwing. I have quite a few of those, and they're a really good stock standard to sort of have around in your possession. Great for mark making, but I do love the Stabilo hardcore. Like, it's a love affair with me and that. One of the other things that I like to use is bold black thick markers like Sharpies. These are the Pitt Artist pens. I'm pretty sure this tip is so damaged from all the work. I also have like brush pens and things, but like a fat chunky black marker that you can do sort of mark making on the tops of things. So this sort of stuff, it really helps you with adding that joining element, mark making down the side of things to join pieces together that look like they shouldn't be together. You're adding a joiner. So that's kind of, I'm trying to think of like terms for things that I do, but something to join pieces of ephemera that look like they don't go together. That's how we bond them, with overlaying a joining pattern, a joining color, that sort of thing with your stuff. So I generally have, you could use your paint markers for that as well, but I also really like having just a black chunky marker, a sharper, a Pitt pen, a Sharpie, a Pitt pen. What else have I got that's like chunky? And the Copic brush pens. These are really good. I'm not really I don't use brush pens heaps, like the real one where it fans out, because I have a really wonky hand, so I don't use those too much. I generally like a hard tip, felt tip, chunky pen like the Sharpies, which I actually don't have at the moment because I have run out. But yeah, pens, I generally use black for most of my sort of mark making because it really helps. They're nice and bold. But sometimes I will also use, you know, big polka dots using my Posca paint pens. This is all paint pen. All these marks are paint pens. I have a lot of control. They're nice and bold. So, you know, you can't go wrong with some paint pens and markers and things like that. That's generally the main sort of stuff. And obviously the last thing is ephemera or patterns. And stuff like that. So things like this would get torn up and reused and redistributed and marked, and that's what I'm talking about, creating your own ephemera, creating your own patterns. If you want to do this for yourself and do that sort of thing, if you want to make them for yourself, if you were to sell, you'd have to make all your ephemera and everything, or your marks and things yourself, because you can't be using other people's work to create your backgrounds. But if you're just doing it for your own enjoyment, for your own journals and things, then by all means grab some journal fodder, scrapbook papers, all that sort of stuff, and get a little pile. I like to have a mixture of neutral papers, so like book pages and things. Of course, I've got nothing actually close to me. I should have been more prepared. Just grabbed a handful. So I have a whole heap of neutral papers that sort of lie around that have botanical prints and things and stuff like that. Or I have sort of cream papers, grid papers, a lot of that sort of stuff. But I do generally use a lot of my other backgrounds. So things like this I would tear up and use as part of my background. I definitely would use some things like this and have in the past, because they're nice and bold. They look really good when they peek out through a transparent color. That's generally the kind of stuff that I look for. I look for textured bits of magazine. When you're looking at magazines, I generally look at fabric and greenery and stuff like that that are nondescript things that I can morph enough so that they're not recognizable. And that's the key when I want to make a pattern or anything like that that I want to sell. I need to make sure that there's no resemblance to any of the original work left, because then I have changed it enough for it to be my own. I generally stick to blocks of color, patterning from photographs and things, so fabric folds, brick walls, all that sort of stuff that is generally out there and not someone else's actual work, if you get what I mean. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I talk to myself around in circles then, but let's get this all off my desk and let's start creating a background, and I'll try and talk you through the steps as best I can. And I hope that this sort of makes sense. I like to have a mixture of mark making tools, opaque stuff and transparent stuff, and bold colors, as well as your ephemera pieces and your pattern papers, plain papers, that sort of stuff, and obviously adhesive, because if you want to make a background, I generally like to collage first and then add stuff on top of it. I'm not the kind of girl that goes straight in with paint, unless I was doing something like a blackout technique like I did with the funky florals for Jane. When I put all colors down, that's generally another way that you could do a background, which I've shown you many times before, especially with yeah, the funky florals. And when I created the sketchbook cover with the big colored eye, if you're an OG inky, you know what I'm talking about. But I'm not going to do the blackout technique today, because the funky florals is generally the most basic way of doing that, and there's lots of other tutorials on there, but I'm kind of talking more about like this sort of stuff today. I'm gonna get a cup of tea because I can already feel my throat sore from all my talking. Good job. Quickly before I start, when I'm talking about transparent mediums versus opaque, the same goes for papers. So with the ephemera and things, when I have bold prints and things, I also like to have things like patterned paper that's very see-through, tracing paper, vellum, tissue paper with bold marks on it, because once you lay some of these down, I also use packaging from orders that have got tissue paper in it, and generally they're very generic patterns like these. Once you layer them down with matte medium, all the white becomes transparent and you're just left with the marks. So I sort of do my best at collecting tissue papers. Obviously some of these, such as the florals and things like this, I wouldn't use for something that I'd use for Patreon, but a classic polka dot I would definitely use because it's very nondescript. Or I literally get blank pieces of tissue paper and create my own. I've done that a heap of times. I will sit there with a bottle of fountain pen ink and a brush, and a lot of the black and white graphic prints that you had previously, well, all of them actually, have been me sitting there hand doing them until I got my iPad Pro and I used my pencil. But a lot of the time they were being created with a paintbrush and a white piece of paper, or I was doing them on tissue paper, things like that. This is where you build up a library of your own journal fodder, your own pattern making, your own painted papers, have swatches, have a whole heap of stuff that you create, and then have them set to the side for making backgrounds. Scan everything. If you make patterns, if you make swatches, if you make painted papers, scan it all in singular form before you combine it all, so you can reuse that over and over again. That is one of the things that I have as the biggest tip, is scan everything. Have a digital library of your patterns, your painted papers, your color swatches, because they can be reused over and over and over again in so many different ways. And I've learned to work harder, not smarter. Working smarter, not harder. And that's definitely one of those things that you can do. Have your own digital library, or have your own stash of things that you can call on. Photocopy things. If you cannot scan things, photocopy them many times so you can reuse them over and over and over, and reimagine your work over and over, so that you're not having to come up with completely new ideas every single time you want to sit down and make a back. I have a heavy card stock, some watercolor paper that I bought at the op shop. There, someone threw out an entire pad of the the Fabriano Studio whole pad, and I got it for $4 at the op shop. And I was like, yep. There was one little sketch on the first page, and I've literally covered that up with a background. But yeah, so it's odd what you find at the op shop. So there you go. I've got that so that I've got something nice and heavy to work with, and I've picked out a few odds and ends from my paper stash. I have bits and pieces from collage sheets. These are the original older patterns that I sent to you guys, that you guys downloaded a while ago now. I can't remember, but it was a while ago. And these are always great things for me to use because they're mine. I've got some of the tissue paper and some of the transparent paper if I feel the need. I have a glue stick, and I've got some tacky glue. I haven't used this before. I've had it for a while, but I want to make sure that everything sticks down. I've got some really old ledger paper from 1884, which I know has no copyright or anything on it, so it's safe for me to use. And I would just start layering my papers down and not really paying too much attention. I will do larger portions of things. I would not do lots of little tiny bits and pieces, but I would definitely sort of layer over. If I have a straight edge, I'll generally put that straight edge onto the side. If I've got like a jagged edge here and a straight, I will put it on a straight edge to save me cutting off. I don't always do that. There's not much of a rhyme or reason to the things that I do. I just generally keep working until I'm happy, until I've found something that I really like the look of. I don't have all straight edges and corners. I will implement like rounded bits, but I generally do large scale things. I don't do a whole lot of little pieces unless I'm going for a pop of color or a certain piece. If I have white edges on the side, I would normally come in the second or third stage with a graphic print down the side, something like that. I generally like to do those sorts of things, so I'll probably do the rest in speed and do a little bit of a voiceover as we go. But I wanted to tell you that I use a heavier cardstock when making my backgrounds. You don't always have to, but I find they hold up really well because I do quite a lot of wet media layers, and I don't like the amount of buckling that happens if I have, like, say, a copy piece of paper or one of the thinner pieces of paper that you can get your. So as you can see, this is my first time using the tacky glue because I squeezed way too hard and then had like a colossal explosion. And I didn't want to ruin any of my brushes trying to spread that out, because knowing me, my brush etiquette, my brush cleaning, especially of my non-watercolor brushes, is pretty poor. I will admit that I abuse my brushes. Not my watercolor ones, not my travel ones, not the ones that cost me my soul, but the more mixed media cheapo brushes I kind of don't have much love for. I do treat my Mab Grave ones a little tiny bit better, but that being said, I do forget when I've used gesso, mixed media, matte medium, gel medium, and Mod Podge, all that sort of stuff, and I have got a bit of a brush graveyard happening. So I've got to be really careful. But the actual glue itself was fabulous. It was really, really strong. Highly recommend. We'll be using that quite a bit. And it is good because sometimes my glue stick sucks. Actually, a lot of time my glue stick sucks. So I think the tacky glue will be a keeper for sure. This process I'm not going to talk heaps about because you see me do this process so much. It is like the stock standard thing that I do for my Nook dwellers. It's a little bit less amount of papers than for a Nook because I normally put a lot more patterned stuff in there. I mean, it's all patterned in its own way, but they're quite large pieces. It's all very neutral, and I love that I can go from something so neutral with browns, greys, and a little bit of, you know, black and white, and then the end result is completely different with all the paints and colors. But I make sure that there are elements in there. There's the the vintage pattern paper that I'm putting down now, that tissue paper, is fantastic. If you can get your hands on some of that, highly recommend. It tints the page, it's got graphic lines, you can see what's underneath it as well. I really, really love using it, and I've got a little bit of a collection at the moment because I had my dress that was made for my birthday wrapped in it, one of the journals that I purchased was wrapped in it, so I have a little bit of a collection of vintage pattern papers. And I highly suggest you get some into your stash because they look fabulous and they just add a nice sort of vintage touch while still being able to see the under stuff. So I always make sure when I layer it down, it's on something that I can see through. So I can see through some of that handwriting under there. And there's a little bit of tissue paper, there's some graphic prints from before when I made them, and they all just sort of live together on the page, and I have them in all little different sections. I don't have everything mottled, and I try and even things out so that it's a bit of everything, because with the backgrounds I tend to look at them in four corners, because I know that when I blow these things up, those four corners are going to create Monday mantras. So I'm always looking at my backgrounds in quadrants and make sure that there's a little bit of everything in each quadrant, and then as a whole they still look really lovely as a whole piece as well. This is where we're at now, and that means that I will now take this to the scanner and scan this in its raw form. I always do that because I find that sometimes if I don't have time to collage, or if I need something quickly, or if I just want something that hasn't been altered heaps and heaps with paint, and I love sort of the neutral colors with the pops of red, I would reprint this multiple times to use as backings for things, because I still think it has its own merits in its raw form before I've thrown color and paint and things at it. And I really just find these really interesting, and I can also use this for a Monday Mantra background. I try and keep some Monday Mantra backgrounds sort of on file that I can grab and use, and because I scan them at 600 DPI, it means I can take little sections. So this could actually do 3 or 4 of the mantras for me, purely on how big I scan them. And then obviously when I adjust it and add paint and color and all the markings, then I have a whole new set of backgrounds that look completely different to this. And so that's what I'm talking about when I mean building up your own sort of library of these, your pattern library, your painted paper library. You kind of have these on file to grab from so that if you're in a pinch, you don't have to sit and build something from scratch. You can go through your library, pull something out, print it, alter that, or just alter over the top of it. There are just, you know, so many things that we can do to make things a quicker process for ourselves. So I am going to go and pop this one in the scanner for me now, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to start working on the actual background. Well, this part of the next step of the background. Even though I talked about a lot of the supplies that I use at the start of this video, that doesn't necessarily mean that I use all of the supplies in one background. I actually don't use the watercolor crayons in this, and I don't use the fountain pen ink, but they are definitely things that I will gravitate to if I'm making a background. So I don't mean all these supplies, I use all of them in the one piece. No, but they are stuff that all work harmoniously together. They all talk to each other, they all mix really well, and they all complement each other. So even if I was to use all of the supplies in this video, they definitely work without a problem, and that's why I always tend to stay in my own zone when it comes to supplies. I love using a mixture of the acrylic paints. These are great for backgrounds. Now, one thing that I get asked a lot is, how am I not making mud? And my answer to that is, I know the colors that work best, and there's a reason why I stick to a certain color palette. I know that if they're going to mix, they're going to make colors that are still quite lovely to the eye, and I'm not going to walk out with bog brown or gray or 50 shades of gray or 50 shades of brown. I know what these colors do with each other. I know if I mix them, I'm going to get a generalized okay feeling, like there with the turquoise and the leftover Quin Gold. I know that I'm not going to get an ugly color out of that. I know that if that Quin Gold mixes with that pink, it's not going to be an ugly color. And so I have found a color palette that I love and adore, and if they mix, they're not going to make horrible colors. And that comes from experience, and that comes from practice. So I generally will always say to you, practice your color play, mix colors together. Don't try and mix a whole ton of them. Generally find colors that you like together, and that if you mix them, they look okay together, and then take those colors and put them into practice. So I know that all these colors will work well. I'm using the applicator of my Dr. P.H. Martin's as a scribble tool, and that's another thing that I love to do. I love very cool scribbles in the corners of my backgrounds. I think they look really awesome. And the Dr. Martin's Hydrus watercolors, I think they are from memory, are so vibrant. I need to use them so much more than I do, because they have so much color payoff. They're vibrant, they're transparent, they are fabulous, and I love using the applicator to do scribbles because it just makes me happy. Sometimes when I don't want to have crazy bright colors, or I want to make some bits of the transparent more opaque, is when I'll come in with a gesso, and that gesso will mix with that colored ink and give me a beautiful hue, and you can get mixtures of the white and the pink together like you see there. I always use my markers to draw leaves and things, and when I came in to start this leaf here, I was like, I haven't done enough groundwork yet to like how this looks. So I go, right, that's it. I need to move those around and get rid of them. Now I know that that blue is going to mix with that pink and also that white, and I'm a-okay with that. If you're not very, confident in doing this, I suggest you dry your layers as you go, because if you think you may make mud, if you're drying your acrylic paint, you can then layer over the top of it without them mixing and without having that stressful feeling of, am I going to make an ugly color? Now generally I don't, and I work, as you can see, 9 times out of 10 in the wet form, because I know my colors very well and I know that they mix very well. But if you want to sort of experiment and play and not do all the sort of pattern color theory behind it beforehand, I would suggest drying your layers as you go, so that you know if you don't want things to get mixed up and to create ugly colors, that if your acrylic paint is dry, generally you can just layer over the top of it, and because it's opaque you won't see it and it's a-okay. But I really love the look of mixing my colors and mixing gesso in with them to give different hues. It's one of the final parts of the job, so I like to work wet. It's not very great for like the side of my arm. Being left-handed, I do wear half my painting up my arm, but I still love it. I also like to get a mixture of different patterns, from dots to scratches to scribbles. I like having things, little patterns in different sections of my background. Now I talk a little bit about this at the end, about why I do this, and generally it's because when I'm making backgrounds like this, I am normally using these for your Monday mantras, and I scan them at such a high DPI that they blow up really big. So those little tiny patterns that you're seeing me making, little dots, little scribbles, they will become huge focal points when I blow it up and use only a portion of the background. So I generally will add certain patterns into every little section of this painted piece of paper, so that when I go to make a Monday mantra, I know there's going to be some little detail in there that may look very small and minute in the larger scale item, but when it is brought to your attention in a small chunk, those little details play a huge part in the actual overall Monday mantra. And so that's how I think now when I make my backgrounds. I make sure there is a little pattern or a little something in every little section of that background, because I know that those little details will become large details when I come to make your mantras. Now I love the Stabilos. I love them so much. They make fantastic mark making tools. I think you should have a watercolor graphite or something that you can have as a really dark thing. And I love making patterns with my Stabilos, and also with markers that can be watered down, because they just look so beautiful. And I will come in and I will use my Stabilos and add some water to activate it. And you can also use a Stabilo for sort of shadowing around certain things. It is fantastic. You can outline with it and then come in with your water and then add a translucent shadow around stuff. I don't do that often, but it is something you definitely can do. I did this crisscross pattern and then I activate it with water, and those, like I said, these little patterns that I'm pulling in now will become really nice focal points when I blow it up. And I just love that you can add those bits and pieces of graphite. Definitely with a Stabilo, they have a nice sort of stark nature, and when you water them down, they have a watercolor feature, so they're not perfect, and I think I really like that. I'm not going for perfection with these. I am just going for pattern and play and color and making sure that everything looks good. And I've got, you know, a little bit of dots, some squiggles, I've got florals, I've got all the sort of things that I love to do. When I make my backgrounds, I literally make them for myself, and you guys just happen to enjoy them. Making art that makes you happy will then in turn make other people happy. It may not always. No, there may be someone out there that hates pink, and I know there are people out there that hates pink, yellow and turquoise, but I don't care. I know that I love this and that this stuff makes me happy, and then I hope that in turn that makes you happy as well. And if not, you can always turn the background black and white in the editing process and just have a really funky grey, black and white. And I know people like Romany, who is not into my color palette but still really loves my pattern and line work. She will turn the hue and saturation on my pieces completely upside down so that they're all orange, purple, green, all those really funky colors that I really stay away from. Or she'll make it grayscale and she'll have all these beautiful grey hues, black and white hues. and she still uses my elements that way. So there are ways around it if you're not into my color palette, and you can definitely do what I'm doing now with your own favorite color palette. There's no reason why you can't do a black and white version of this, and hell no. I would love to do a vintage version, and I definitely think that it could work because the process is so stock standard and so simple to follow along that if you have these sort of elements and it's sort of like a very simple recipe, you can make backgrounds for days, man. Make backgrounds for days, and they make fantastic journal covers.
Secondhand, I felt a bit forgotten. Not your plan, but now the days of silence outgrow the fun things we have done. But tell me, do you wanna carry on?
Right, I think I'm going to leave this one here. Sometimes I do a lot more layers, sometimes I do a lot less, but when I make things like this, I'm normally thinking of Monday mantras when I create these, because I like to have pockets of pattern in certain sections. And I've just realized that this little one here doesn't have that little maroon dot, and so I think about each sort of quadrant of the page. So in here I have the if I was to cut it this way, you would have some of that pink scribble, you'd have some of those graphite crosses, you'd have a little touch of those little dots, because I'm blowing these up really large. So there's a whole heap of little details in there that become very prominent when you cut them down. And then you see in this little section, you're going to have some of that sort of inky Stabilo crisscross. You're going to have a little bit of the black and white pattern, some of the spots. All sections have little bits of pattern in them, little details that will, when broken apart, will really shine on their own. As a collective, it looks very bright and colorful and lovely, but when you start ripping things up, those little patterns and those little details will shine through. And because you're thinking about your backgrounds as things to use in your collages, and I think about them in the way that I see Monday mantras, I always try and add little interesting bits of patterning in small spurts throughout the page, because I know that when it gets used, those are going to really shine through, especially if it gets ripped up, torn up. If I had to rip up, you know, down the middle, I'm going to have bits of leaves, bits of these yellow dots. I'm going to have some of the under papers showing through. That's why I talk about having opaque and transparency, because you get all these little details in here. Like you can see some of the text in here. You can see the black and white pattern in here. There's all little bits of those under papers. Yes, a lot of them get covered up. That's okay. But I like to have some of that original paper show through, because it's something that I wouldn't be able to achieve with paint or anything, or without a lot of heavy lifting work. So these sorts of things here. And that's when I would use a more transparent color if I wanted a pattern to show through more. Or I would do a floral. I love florals or leaves and things like that. They work really well. And leave those exposed, and then come and color these bits in and block them out. So you have like sections that are all blocked up, and you've got the bits of the leaves that are all sort of still have some of the paper showing through. Those sorts of things I love. And again, when I blow it up and I look at it, they're going to become really big details, even though they're very minute in what they look like. And so the same goes for like these sorts of things. Try and yank it out. You have bits and pieces of patterning. It is very much the same colors. I love my colorways. I work very similar, and you can see that this one's got a lot more long chunks of patterning and things like that. But when I blew it up, I had like sections of this scribble. I have these big things became huge components. This scribble here became huge components. So there are so many ways when I scan it and make it huge. So I always make sure that I have these little pockets of patterning, the little dots and things, because when it gets blown up, when it gets ripped apart, those little details become focal points. So altogether, it looks very bright and colorful and patterny, but when you break it down, they become larger scale things that look really lovely. and I might come back in and sort of draw around things. I have sort of restrained myself a little bit so I can show you kind of the things that I like to do. You can see that there's quite a lot of transparency in there. You can still see text in here. I do like to water down my markers when I want them to have a more transparent, if I'm just staining, that sort of thing. But that's generally the sort of thought processes I think. I have little bits and pieces happening in all different quadrants of the page because I know that it's going to get ripped up, it's going to get scanned, it's going to get blown up. So I try and give a little bit to each section while still making it sort of a beautiful thing to look at as a whole. See, I could see many people sort of wrap that around a book cover and slap on a focal image and you're good to go. So that's generally the recipe I follow 9 times out of 10 when I'm doing this sort of background thing. I could do more doodling. I mean, I didn't bring in my markers. I could definitely come in with black markers and add more sort of bolder things. I could do black and white stripes down the side. Normally I would come in. I didn't bring my heat gun into the room and it's too cold to leave this room. I've got this room really heated up. So normally I would heat things so that I could use stuff, but this is still very wet. As you can see, I was having a little bit of trouble here because I was being very impatient. But I'm working with a lot of wet medium, so you are going to get some of your papers coming up every now and again because it's just the nature of the beast, especially if you're watering down acrylic paints to make them more transparent. So if you do have opaque paint, just add some water and get it down. But these fluid acrylics are fabulous for being very transparent. Another thing I didn't use much in this are the crayons. You can definitely get those in there. They're fabulous. I don't generally use everything all at once. I kind of pick and choose. You saw me use a lot more acrylic paint and the Stabilo pencil this time, and the paint markers, and then one time I might do all ink or all crayons, but they're the general things, the general tools that I grab towards, but doesn't mean I use them all in the one piece. They're my favorite things to use, and they all sort of talk to each other and work well with each other. They mix, they bond, they don't really resist each other. They're kind of very harmonious working tools, and that's kind of why I use them. So yeah, that is a little bit of an insight into how and why I do things with my backgrounds, the tools I use. If there's something that I haven't covered that you'd really like to know, let me know. I generally use the same color palette because they are my favorites, and if I'm working with my favorite colors, they make me happy, they make me want to work more. I could probably do a vintage version because I'm quite enjoying that with a lot of browns and creams, and I'd probably bring in, say, this color to sort of have a bit of vibrancy, maybe even a muted pink, that sort of thing. That's probably all I would do, and then have browns and golds and rusts and all that sort of thing. It generally will work the same. It's just I enjoy these colors, and I know that they look fabulous blown up, and they work for the Monday mantras. If I'm feeling like people are getting sick of those colors, I will just alter the color in Photoshop, and that way it'll give you a completely different hue and a different look. I don't do it often. And I can scan this and then pull it into Procreate and add more details. I can play with patterning. I can do a whole lot of things. I know I said that I would do 2 versions of it. I will do the second version in another video. I feel like I've talked a heap about this one thing, and I don't want it to be too long a video for you. So I'll probably in the studio vlog this month talk about how I would take things like this, or take things like certain elements and digitally combine them. I know not everyone's really a massive fan of the digital aspect of the digital aspect of mixed media, but it is something that I use quite a lot, and definitely I will show you how I can alter this piece yet again in the studio vlog, where I add digital details, and that's a way for you to do things and experiment with line work and patterns and not feel like you're going to mess it up. I would definitely scan it in stages. If you get to that point where you're feeling like you want to do more but you don't want to mess it up, scan it, scan it, scan it, scan it. I cannot say that enough. That means that you'll have it in a stage that you absolutely love, and say you did take it too far and you hate it, you can always use that scanned image. Yes, it's not the actual piece, but it's better than having no recollection, no feel of the piece before you took it too far. And in the end of the day, you can always cover it up and start again. Like, nothing is permanent in this life, especially with art, but I do like the digital factor where I can try things and experiment with things, see what works and see what doesn't, and then I can bring those mistakes, I can learn from the mistakes of the things that I don't like and bring that into my traditional work. If I find something that really works digitally, I can then go into a traditional piece with a bit more confidence, knowing, well, it really looked good in the digital form, it should pretty much translate very well into the traditional form 9 times out of 10. So I will do a digital version of the background or show you my processes from taking traditional pieces and like different elements and combining them. It's just a little layering and making your layers transparent and all that sort of thing, very much like this, just digital. But because I spent so much time sort of walking you through this process, I kind of don't want to bombard you too much. So I think the traditional version will be the version for this video, and then I will pop in the background version for your studio vlog for this month. But I hope you've enjoyed this process video and sort of had a little look into how I think when I make my backgrounds, what I do, the little tips and tricks, because I do blow my images up. I try and get a lot of mileage out of my backgrounds, so I'm not constantly having to make a new one every week for Monday Mantra. I do try and get the most out of one. And even the under painting, the very vintage one, I definitely would bring that into Procreate and do a whole lot of vintage looking things to it. But yeah, if you have any questions, leave them down below. If you like this kind of video where I sort of break down my process, if there's a process that you're intrigued about, let me know and I'll see what I can do about making that one happen for you as well. Now it's time for me to go and hang out with my family because it's Saturday morning here. I'd been putting off making this part of the video because I was like, oh, I don't want to stuff it up. I don't want to make an ugly background. But in the end of the day, if you're using your favorite colors, you're using your favorite supplies, you can always, you always win. You always win. Have a wonderful weekend, Inkies, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.